As chair of the genealogy group, some of you may have heard a presentation I did relating genealogy in Ireland and how difficult it is to research records. But this is a different approach to the subject. I think Americans have a lot of misconceptions about the Irish in general. First of all, many people think that the national color might be green. It's not. It's actually azure blue. The green represents the Roman Catholic religion. They had a flag that was green with a harp on it. And the harp is the national instrument and a symbol for Ireland. Some people will believe that Ireland has always celebrated St. Patrick's Day in a big holiday way, the way we do here. Party, 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 pub crawl. But it actually was illegal to sell alcohol in Ireland until around 1966. And the first St. Patrick's Day party didn't happen, a parade rather, didn't happen in Ireland until 1996 in Dublin. So it was more a situation where people would go to church to celebrate the St. Patrick. And maybe have a nice dinner that evening with the family, but it was not a party kind of thing. Also, I'm always struck, we've been to Ireland several times, and I've always asked, what is that corned beef and cabbage thing you have going on over there in the United States? They don't even eat it. So that's kind of funny. Wow. And leprechauns in the United States are sort of a comic character, always friendly. Leprechauns really, in Ireland, the wee people, are just a portion of the Celtic tradition of mythology. And they're not always very kind. They're tricksters more than anything. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So, onward. Basically, I'm going to cover pagan practices, Christianity and the monastic culture, and the Viking invasion, and a thing called the plantation system, which is nothing like what we had. Oliver Cromwell and English rule in general, which was not the best thing that ever happened to Ireland. The Great Hunger, the Easter Rising, which led to the Irish Free State, the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement, and I'm going to really talk a lot about Brexit's impact today and try to make that as understandable as possible. It's a bit of a mess right at the moment. All right, okay, so who are the Celts? The Celts basically were all over Europe, and they were seafarers. They really settled out, and you can't see it on here, this would be like where Spain is today, the Iberian Peninsula. They had quite a settlement there. They moved up through this area. They were also way over here on the other side of Europe. They were kind of everywhere. And they were an interesting group of people that basically the Romans thought they were nuts, and maybe they were right, I don't know, because they would go to war and battle and fight frequently naked with their bodies painted. They were absolutely fearless, and part of that stems from the fact that the Celts believed in an afterlife. Among many things, they didn't look at death at all the way the Romans and the rest of the world were looking at it. And the Romans kind of lumped them together with all the other groups that were in existence at that time. The Gauls, the Cimbria, basically they were one of the barbarian groups, and they really didn't distinguish them too much from the other barbarian groups, but they did think the Celts were particularly crazy. So Celts also had a real foundation in mythology. Their mythology and their history were all lumped together, and they looked at mythology as truth, what really happened. And they believed in shape-shifting, that this is part of the we people thing. You could be talking to somebody that looked like a regular human being in some of the Irish folk tales, and they shapeshift and turn into a sea monster, a fairy, all kinds of things. And they use their mythology to explain the different things around us in the world that are difficult to understand, and they come up with a story to explain everything. And this carried over into the religion later on. It's an important force. So, let me see. Okay. They didn't really have any written records, which is why storytelling was so important to them. Whoops, I'm going backwards. That's what they looked like, and you can sort of gather the warriors, why the Romans thought they really were a little different. So, time goes on. This is actually pre-Celtic. This is New Grange in County Meath. These are 5,000 years old, archaeologists say. They were megalithic passages. If you've ever been to New Grange, and it's a very interesting little tunnel type thing that leads you into the center, where they obviously had some religious celebrations on the solstice and things like that. There were lots of, and they buried dead there, and they actually had human sacrifice, and so that was a pagan background. There are lots of these types of things, mazes and such, in the Boyne Valley that archaeologists have discovered over time. So, way later on, you get the Druids, and their worldview was a lot like, it really stems from the way the Celts looked at the world. They believed there were doorways that you could drift through and be in a different world, a fairy-like world, or a crazy world, or a stormy world. Things could happen to you, and you could be swept into this world. It was dangerous to go out in the moonlight, because that's when these things would happen a lot. And like the Celts, they didn't distinguish myth and history. They were really all one and the same. This is at a time when things weren't written down. Everything was done through storytelling. So the Druids were the highest members of the learned class, and they included poets, bards, lawyers, physicians, genealogists, even agriculturalists, and meteorologists and storytellers. And Julius Caesar noted that they had to study for about 20 years to memorize all the things that were important for Druids to know. And they had a very high place in society. Interestingly, when Christianity came to Ireland, it was before St. Patrick's time, the monks were the earliest priests and such in Christianity in Ireland, when that came to Ireland. So the wee people, as I said, are part of, they just carried on, they never went away. My mother always blamed anything missing on the house of the wee people coming in the night. Where are the car keys? The wee people took them. So that's sort of the fun side of the wee people. But you look over here, and this is a cartoon from a British newspaper by an artist during that time, George Cruikshank. And the husband looks a little frightened, and the wife looks like she's having a good time. And that's sort of like, you don't quite know what to make of these wee people. So, okay, so it's Europe now, and it's about 400 AD. And Christianity is starting to have lots of issues. It was kind of rolling along nicely, and then this guy Pelagius and another guy, Augustine of Hippo, really had different views of Christianity that you can still see in Christianity today. All the different sects of Christianity will have followed totally Augustine, totally Pelagius, and some people, and many in between, like all faiths people view them in a different way. But Augustine of Hippo basically felt that man had original sin. The only way they could be redeemed was bringing Christ into their life. If they didn't bring Christ into their life, they were kind of done for. And it was impossible to have any success in life without bringing Christ into your life. And also that divine grace from God would forgive you for all of your sins, no matter what. That's a relevant belief still today. Pelagius believed, on the other hand, that if God made man, man's necessarily good, because God's not going to make something that isn't good. And they don't need to necessarily accept Christ into their life to be saved, so to speak. That man has free will, he can make choices. And what we need to be focused on in his mind was that people should be schooled to make the right choices and follow life the way Jesus Christ did. So this is an argument going on the continent. And meanwhile, in Ireland, life is going on with the Druids and an interesting form of Christianity. And the rest of Europe is thinking Ireland's still a wild and crazy place, because that's where the Celts were. And then along comes St. Patrick. St. Patrick was a real person. I didn't really know that when I was a kid. I came to realize that over time. But we know he was a real person, and we know things about him because he wrote down many things about his life in a piece called The Declaration. There are lots of misunderstandings about St. Patrick's. He probably did not use the shamrock to explain the Trinity, because the Celts, I forgot to tell you, also all of their gods were three in one. And so this wouldn't have been something that the Irish needed to explain to them. All the gods that they had in their life, if they were in their mythology, were three in one. So he was the son of a wealthy deacon, Calpurnius, in Wales. And Patrick was captured on the seacoast of Wales and put into slavery in Antrim, Ireland, or Maugh, maybe, but somewhere up in the northern part of Ireland. And he was only 16 when that happened, and he spent 6 years in slavery. And he had a dream one night, he says in the Declaration, that he could escape freely, and he would go to the coast, and he would be guided by the Spirit, and he would meet up with someone that could take him back to Wales. And pretty much that's the way it happened. He met pirates, of all things, and they took him back to Wales. And so he really, because he had been swept away from Wales at the height of when he would have been having a grand education, didn't ever really learn to write, didn't learn about the Greeks and such the way other Christian bishops and priests did. It's thought that he probably went to some kind of a seminary, but nobody knows for sure. But around 431, he came back to Ireland and started a church in Armagh, and with a local chieftain, and it kind of went from there. Patrick disliked the hierarchical structure of the Roman Catholic Church. He probably was so successful in Ireland because he was very open to weaving Irish myth into Christianity. Still today, an important saint is like Saint Bridget. There is a goddess in Irish mythology that is a Bridget, and she's 3 in 1, and Saint Bridget seems to have all the traits that goddess had. So he really did not tell them they had to believe one way or another. They were kind of removed from the arguments that were going on the continent. And so Christianity is just slightly different in Ireland. In that they had next slide here, they had monasteries. And in these monasteries, they were encouraged by St. Patrick. They had been in existence before he got there, but he encouraged them to make them larger. Some of the monks wanted to live as hermits, so they lived in stone structures that are just enough to fit a body into, and they lived all alone in the Irish countryside. Their main job was to pray, and also they were scribes. This is a very important part of their job. And St. Patrick convinced them to spread the word, and they began to, he encouraged that monasteries be developed in other places. One of the things that many of us are familiar with is the Book of Kells. That was probably created around 800, and we say probably because it's hard to date these things, and then swept away to Kells in 1806 during the Viking raid. The monastery at Iona is in Scotland, and it was run by monks of the order called St. Columba. So is the one in Kells. And so that's where they ran to with the Book of Kells. Book of Kells is beautiful Celtic artwork, gorgeous. It's the 4 Gospels. And it's probably related to the book that is at Lindisfarne, the Holy Island in northern England, that was written in between 700 and 715 by these same St. Columba monks, another branch of them. So it was an important kind of thing to do. When the Vikings raided, they would rip the covers off some of these types of books that took years and years and years to create, because they were frequently gold and silver. These books were created to be used during the worship service. They weren't the entire Bible. So I mentioned the Vikings. The Vikings came along, and they were there for quite a long time, and they actually kind of assimilated into Ireland. They did kind of a lot of amazing things that we don't give them credit for in most cases. And they were chased out of Ireland in 1114 AD when they lost a battle. But as they were losing the battle, they discovered that Brian Boru and his son were in a tent, and they stabbed him on their way out, killed him basically, as they were retreating. But some of the good things that the Vikings did, they built Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. They're responsible for that. They established the city of Waterford. It was their naval base. And they also established major training centers in Ireland, Dublin being one of them, Wexford, Cork, all places that most of us have heard of. And the interesting thing is the Gaelic language and the Norse language came over time to share many words, vocabulary. And they established trade routes from Ireland to Scandinavia, which were kind of important in the next few hundred years. And they basically assimilated into the culture, intermarried, and most people that are Irish will discover that they have some Viking DNA. So the Vikings weren't the worst thing that happened to Ireland. I have to say that the English just didn't do too well, and they're continuing to have problems in Ireland. It's a sad, sad story. This is Adrian, Pope Adrian, who was an English pope. And this is somebody that most of us have heard of, Henry II of England, who was actually the Angevin Empire king at first. He then became a Plantagenet. This is a soap opera almost, this particular guy. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, basically to get her land. But he wound up, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine upon her annulment from Louis of France, Louis VII of France. Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine had been married for 15 years and had only produced 2 daughters, and Louis was getting worried about having an heir. And Eleanor really wanted to get out of the relationship too. And there's a thing called consanguinity. They got the Pope to annul the marriage because of consanguinity, meaning they were too close to cousins to be married. And so then, only 2 months later, Henry marries Eleanor of Aquitaine because she's now available. And he is actually Eleanor's 3rd cousin, which is a little more distant. Louis was more like the 2nd cousin. And that was legal. And so they got married. But Louis and Henry didn't get along too well. They had an on again, off again war, little skirmishes going as Henry is trying to gain land and Louis is trying to gain land. This is a time when England, really, Henry was king of England, but only a very small portion of England, as we know it today. And so what does he do? He says that he talked to Pope Adrian and got him to write what was called a Laudabilter in 1155 on the grounds that Ireland needed some overseeing and giving Henry permission to be an overseer and to go there and try and straighten them out because they were straying from true Christianity. Thing is, he kept this in his pocket. Nobody really ever saw it. And around 1171, he sees his opportunity to, he didn't really invade. He just sort of arrived and started building castles and had other people build castles and got a foothold in England. And his main reason, in my mind, was just so that Louis wouldn't get there first. That's basically how it is. But if you know anything about the planned action, that's a soap opera that could be another entire lecture. So around 1367, the English decided things were getting a little too dicey. The Irish were developing some French customs. They developed a dance called set dancing that they were doing in the south of Ireland that was mimicking dance in France. And it was just making them a little bit nervous. It became, in these statutes, one of the things was to not ride a horse like a Frenchman, whatever that was, I don't know. And so they passed a bunch of things trying to make them more English. It became illegal to speak Irish, Gaelic. That was pretty much ignored whenever possible. It was legal to perform Irish music and to dance like an Irishman, and to pursue various Irish pastimes, conduct Irish commerce, appoint Irish clergy, and appoint Irish judges. Basically, it was the beginning of the real trouble here. That later on developed into what you might have heard of, the penal laws. Those were very harsh. They went from the 15th to the 18th century with those, and it was basically sort of to dehumanize the Catholics, to reduce them to complete ignorance. It was illegal for them to be educated, to record their births, deaths, and marriages, to pass things down to their children. A long list of things that they weren't able to do. They weren't allowed to hold office. They weren't allowed to teach the kids or anything. The Irish worked around this. They would have church in the woods. They buried their documents in caves and in the woods. And basically, it kind of was always in place, enforced harshly at times, and ignored whenever possible by the Catholics. But these laws existed for a long time. And they would hunt down the schoolmasters and the priests with bloodhounds and kill them if they were discovered. So, okay, 1542, you get King Henry VIII comes along, and he has Parliament. An act was passed in 1542 where Henry decides that he's going to be the King of Ireland. And he gets the Holy See in Rome to recognize that did not recognize the act that Henry had passed, rather, because Henry was now a Protestant. So there was a lot of kerfuffle about that. Instead, Rome considered Ireland to be a feudal fief of the papacy. And then along comes James VI of Scotland, who later becomes James I of Scotland and England. And in 1617, he says, well, I am going to declare myself to be the King of Ireland. And he proceeds to do some things that are they kind of backfire over time. The first thing he decides he's going to do is to establish this thing called plantations. Now, plantations are not the way we think of them in the United States. These plantations were, we're going to take the Catholic lands away from them, give them to English lords, and then the English lords are going to rent out the property, and they're only going to rent, in his mind, to Protestants. We're going to convert all of the Catholics that are in Northern Ireland to Church of England. And that was, he really thought that was going to work, and it didn't really go so well. Basically, before the plantations actually started in 1609. In 1607, there was so much skirmishing going on that the earls, the kings of these little kingdoms and earls, were forced to leave Ireland. The British were confiscating their land in preparation for King James's plan to give this land to the lords. And they leave, going to France and actually Spain. More than that, they go to Europe, basically hoping that they'll get some help from Europe against the British. But they wound up not coming back. It was a continual war. The population of Ulster decreased significantly. There was plague, and basically it forced a lot of people to leave. So this is what the Ulster Plantation was at that point in time. You'll notice Donegal today, if you know, is not part of Northern Ireland. And neither is Monaghan and County Cavan. They are in the Irish Republic. Today in Northern Ireland, you have Antrim, Down, Armagh, Tyrone, and Derry, basically, and Fermanagh. And that is Northern Ireland today. But the plantations were not in Antrim and Down at that point in time when King James started this project. And it's interesting how it's evolved, where now this is a highly Protestant area. And this is not as Protestant as it's now a little more even, Protestants and Catholics. So what happened was, by 1609, James says, well, all of those earls were traitors. We're going to just totally confiscate their land. And we're going to go through with my plan. And he believed truly in his heart that the Irish culture, the Gaelic culture, needed to be wiped out. It was just too wild and crazy for him. The interesting thing about King James is his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic. He was married to a queen who was from Denmark and was also a Catholic. So when he first came to power, all the Catholics in this area thought life would get better for them, and it actually got worse. He was very anti-Catholic in spite of being married to a Catholic and his mother being a Catholic. He was a Protestant. So the London merchants that he talked into financing the plantations renamed it Londonderry. So even still today, everything becomes a source of conflict. In Londonderry today, if you call it Londonderry, you're obviously a Catholic, and if you call it Derry, you're a Protestant. And that's just the way it goes. They tried to change the name of the county. If you're looking on a map today, it's labeled Londonderry, but anybody that's Catholic in that area is calling it Derry still. A really interesting thing about this is this wasn't such a good deal for the Protestants either. They could only export to and trade with England. And England would then export the goods to somebody else at a higher price. So there's a lot of resentment going on in all directions. So then you have the War of the Three Kingdoms. We pretty much know that Charles I loses his head eventually, but he wound up at war with Scotland, Ireland, and within England, all at the same time, which is the War of the Three Kingdoms. The problem in Scotland was that they had decided they were going to tell everyone in Scotland that they needed to use the Book of Common Prayer, which is Church of England prayer book for church. Anybody that's Episcopalian in the United States is probably familiar with. And the Scottish were mostly Presbyterians, and they were a little mad about all that. And they called themselves the Covenanters, and they started a war with Charles. So he's got a war going on that front. And then the Irish Catholics are very upset with Charles, just because of the way they're being treated. And then there's the Royalists who are happy with Charles. And then the parliamentarians, who actually are eventually led by Oliver Cromwell, they wanted to do away with Charles and the Catholics. So you got a lot of fighting going on here. And lots of political, religious, and ethnic aspects to it. The Irish Confederate Wars lasted, that part of the War of the Three Kingdoms, started in 1641, went to 1653, and I have to say that really there was nothing good going on here on any side. They were just horrible. Many atrocities. The upshot, this is a cartoon, or not cartoon, but an engraving that was duplicated at the time. This is supposedly showing Catholics taking a child, putting a spear through them, and throwing him into a lake and drowning them. There's no real documentation that anything like that happened, but let's just say they were horrible to one another. Everybody was bad. So what happens at the end in 1653? We get Oliver Cromwell coming along, and he's a very controversial figure in history. He, excuse me, he basically is hated by Catholics, mostly because he hated them. So they have really nothing good to say about him. The Protestants liked him because he it's hard to say why, because they did. They kind of revere him today. If you're in Belfast, you might see a mural talking about what a good guy he was because he killed so many Catholics. If you're familiar with the murals in Belfast. But he was a controversial figure. When he died of natural causes, he was buried at Westminster, and then his son took over. His son was incompetent, took over the Parliament because he started, they beheaded Charles, and he becomes, Cromwell becomes the leader of the parliamentarians and the Parliament in England, the Lord Protector. But when he dies in 1660, his son is incompetent. I mean, he died, excuse me, in 1658. By 1660, his son is considered incompetent, and the Stuarts are restored to power. Basically, the Royal Parliament didn't do Ireland any good at that point. They basically continued to war with them because the Catholics were aligned with the Royalists who had supported Charles. And there was wide destruction of food, burning of forests, and bubonic plague broke out, and things were pretty miserable. And more Catholic land was confiscated and more penal laws were written. So we go along now, let's just skip a couple hundred years ahead. And basically, this lithograph was written created around 1880, 90 years after the event. But in 1798, the United Irishmen formed, and these were mostly Irish lords in Southern Ireland who wanted to overthrow the crown and wanted to be free of England because things had just gotten to be so onerous. So this is sort of, I'm not sure these men were all ever in the same room looking this dressed up and all together, but the guy here, this is, his name is Wolfe, and this guy is Emmett, and they were the two leaders. You notice that the outfits that a lot of them are wearing are sort of French. This is called the chef de brigade or something along that line, type of uniform that was copied from the French. They were very enamored with the revolution that was going on in France at the time, had gone on, and still was. They were in the throes of forming their new government, and they actually Wolfe, this guy here, went to France and asked them for help to overthrow the English and get rid of them. And that was a disaster. They wound up losing that battle because the British got wind of it. And basically, Tone wound up dying mysteriously in prison. And all the men that were captured, including Emmett, were tortured and revealed a lot of details about the invasion and who was involved, and didn't do too well. they didn't get hung at the gallows, most of them, a few of them did. But Emmett managed, even though he'd been a leader, to escape being put to death, and tried to reinvade in 1803, and at that time the British said, well, twice is too much, and they hung him. So that was the end of him. And this was not very successful, but it was probably the beginning of when the Irish started saying, these guys have got to get out of here. So the British at the same time are thinking, we have to have an act of union where we're going to do away with the Irish Parliament. They're up to no good over there. They're causing all kinds of trouble. And they took more power away because of the 1719 invasion from the Irish than even before, which almost seemed impossible, but they did. And so now Ireland is ruled by 1,000 MPs, 4 Lords Spiritual, and 28 Temporals. There were all Anglicans, no Catholics. And Ireland is mainly a Catholic place. Okay, then along around 1815, they start passing these things called corn laws. Now, corn in Great Britain is any kind of grain. It's wheat, any kind of grain that you might eat. And they started passing these laws where they put high tariffs on any grain that was imported to Ireland, and all grain was classified as corn, so that's why they're called the Corn Laws. And these acts discouraged the importation of corn into Ireland because it had to have a high tariff on it. And every bit of grain that was produced in Ireland was to be shipped to England by their landlords and sold to the British at a very reasonable price. Somehow the British thought that this was going to work out well, and it really didn't. The result was that the Irish became dependent on the potato as an important part of their diet, and the only source they had of carbohydrates of any significance. And that's how they came to rely on potato. So Great Hunger comes along in 1845, and this is actually a pro-nationalist Catholic cartoon about the British that was published in 1890, but it sort of kind of wraps up all into one little package what was going on. Tenants were being evicted because they couldn't pay their rent, they were starving, people were dying on the road. They had some poor laws passed where the landlords were responsible for feeding them. They didn't want to do that, so they evicted them. Some of the landlords even paid the passage for their tenants to go to the United States. Some of the Irish living there actually got themselves arrested on purpose so that they could be shipped to Australia. It was just a horrible, horrible time where lots of people were dying of hunger because there was no food. In my own personal history, I had discovered that some of my ancestors in prison for stealing turnips. So the sad thing is there was plenty of food available in Ireland. There were lots of grain crops and cattle, pigs, chickens, sheep, but most of it was shipped to England. And the British thought this is the way it should be. The Prime Minister Peel appointed a guy named Charles Trevelyan to handle hunger relief. But he was awful. There's a song, "The Fields of Athenry," an Irish ballad, where there's a line that they stole Trevelyan's corn so that the young could see the morn. And he was just totally indifferent to their needs. He was a micromanager who never managed to get any food that was supposed to go to Ireland. He set up workhouses for the poor, but there was no work for them to do there. Riots broke out, and because in these poorhouses, so Trevelyan sent Royal Dragoons to kill all the people in the poorhouses. And that wasn't going too well. And then the Chancellor Exchequer at that time, Lord Monteagle, saw a famine. He said this is a direct quote, as an effective mechanism for controlling excess population. So, and the Whig Prime Minister, John Russell, refused to import food to assist the Irish and encouraged the landlords to import crops to England while the Irish were starving. And as I said, they were required to create these relief systems, but it was easier to evict them and maybe pay their passage to another country than to set up the relief. And Benjamin Disraeli, there was reference to this if you watched Victoria on PBS, her biography. She called him Dizzy. And he was strongly opposed to the repeal of the Corn Laws. And it fell to the rest of the world to come to the aid of the Irish. Victoria actually was writing letters appealing to different groups to help. And the Choctaw Indians actually sent Indian cob corn to Ireland. The problem is it needs to be ground in a way that the Irish didn't know how to grind it, and it caused some death because the Indian corn was rough on their digestive system, and eventually they learned how to mix it with some things and make it not tear up their intestines. But and even Muslim nations were helping. But the English, Sir Robert Peel was trying to get these corn laws repealed. He finally gets them repealed in 1846, about a year and a half into the famine when that happened. But in order to get the vote, he was told they would vote to repeal the corn laws if he resigned, so he winds up resigning. So you think, the Irish, how did they put up with this? Well, they were really trying all along to get out from under England. It just was, things were set up sort of like to make it impossible. This guy, Daniel O'Connell, is an Irish hero known as the Emancipator, and he set the foundation for he wanted to have like a home rule kind of thing. It wasn't called that at that point, but he wanted to break free of the British, and he spent a lot of time in prison as a result of his political activities, and developed some health problems there, and eventually did die of those health problems while he was on a trip to Rome, a pilgrimage, in 1847. So this is sort of like around the time of the famine when he dies, and he was trying to fight for their rights. And he had been from a wealthy Roman Catholic family that had their lands confiscated, and that's why he was probably as active as he was with that effort. Next come along another guy that maybe some of you have heard of, Charles Stewart Parnell. There are many streets in, I know there's a street in Jersey City, near where I grew up, named Parnell Street, named after him. That was an Irish Catholic community, and they named it after him. He was a Protestant, but his mother was an American, and his father was a wealthy Anglo-Irish landowner in Wicklow, and he spent a lot of effort trying to get home rule going. Home rule would have meant that they could at least have their parliament back and be recognized as a separate entity. And he was a member of parliament himself in England, and he was expelled from parliament over it, and he spent some time in prison for his political beliefs. But this is somebody that the Irish still revere as a hero. So by 1912, this is getting a little crazy over there, and they started to really have a lot of political cartoons going on, and fighting and skirmishes and guerrilla type activity, as we would call it today, just trying to break free of Ireland. But in Ulster, the northern part of Ireland, largely Protestant at this point, they didn't want to break away from England. It was basically the lands that were totally occupied by Catholics that wanted to break away from England. So this is a cartoon from that time about that conflict. So along comes a guy named James Connolly. He was born to Irish Catholics in Glasgow, and he grew up very poor, and he took on many socialist causes in his adult life. At one point he joined the British Army because he was starving and he needed a job, but didn't use his real name because the English were already realized he was a bit of a rebel. But eventually he joins the Dublin Brigade, and he was the commandant of the Dublin Brigade, which was a division of the Ulster Volunteers. And they are responsible for the Easter Rising in 1916. If you watched Downton Abbey, there was some reference to that in there. And he was severely wounded and captured and sentenced to death by firing squad in that effort, which the Irish nationalists lost. And this next painting is a rather famous painting by Walter Paget that is This is James Connolly on this stretcher here. In the battle, he was severely wounded. And this led to big problems for the British. They had, World War I had broken out in 1914. The British were trying to get the United States to help them in the effort. It was looking, when the Lusitania was sunk, that they probably had some leverage there. They were going to get the U.S. to do it. But then what did the British do here? He's near death. The physician said he can't be put before a firing squad because he can't stand up. So they tied him to a chair and killed him by firing squad when he was about to die in a couple of hours anyway. This did not go over well in all of the, by this point in history, the Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, New York, and many other cities are overwhelmed with Irish Catholics sympathetic to the nationalist cause. And it didn't help anybody that wanted to enter World War I get their point of view across in our Congress. And so killing James Connolly that way kind of delayed the U.S. entry into World War I, which is maybe a good thing. Okay, so they killed James Connolly. Nothing's put to rest. The conflict continues with England, and it now comes to 1921, and there is a treaty proposed to divide Ireland into two countries. Unfortunately, the terms of the treaty created new divisions in Ireland because now, before they were asking for Ireland just to be united, and now what they've got is they've got two countries, and it's not going well at all. The nationalists are now saying, we don't just want home rule anymore. We want England out of here totally, and we want one united Ireland. We want the whole thing. And so civil war erupts on June 28, 1922. And for years, I had been told that this building was blown up by, because the nationalists who were fighting had stored their ammunition in the Public Records Office. But historians recently have been investigating this, and actually they think the Four Courts building and the Public Records Office blew up on different days, and that maybe the British Army was responsible. For whatever reason, this building was blown up, either on June 28th or June 30th, depending on who you're talking to. And this is the Public Records Office, and genealogy documents evidently were floating all over the city for days. Very sad day for all genealogists. So it lasted, the Irish Civil War lasted until 1923, when the treaty that we know today was written, where you can see this portion of Ireland is what's now Northern Ireland, Republic of Northern Ireland, and this is the Republic of Ireland. And so the anti-treaty faction that wanted totally united Ireland did not succeed, and thus we have the two Irelands we have today. Okay, so what did that create? A border. This was kind of interesting. They had, if you look back at the map again, you're going to try and create customs protection all along here, this zigzag border. It didn't work very well. There were 16 checkpoints. They closed off some minor roads so that people wouldn't be able to get through them, but what's that going to do? There was a lot of smuggling going on. Commerce got real tricky. They lived with this very, very bad situation and assumed smuggling. Everybody was involved in it, it seems, until 1993, when Great Britain joined the European Union. That's finally what got them out of the border checks, because now they're all in the European Union, and anybody that's traveled in Europe knows now it's easy to go from one country to another, and that eliminated the border. But from 1923 until there were several attempts to kind of calm things down, and it wasn't working. There was just so much animosity because it had just been developed to a point where sometimes I think people don't even know why they're fighting anymore. And the fighting just continued. Only for a very brief time after the treaty in 1923 were things calm. By the 1960s, the unrest was so intense and violent that everybody around the world was kind of watching in horror. We were there, I believe, in around 1997, and we couldn't even go into Northern Ireland. You weren't allowed in because it was too dangerous. That was right before the peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. And over that time, 3,500 people or more had died as a result of the Troubles. And it was so, when we were there in 2008, the street signs were taken down because there were so many outsiders coming in to cause trouble. In '73, everything looked like it could be solved with this thing called the Sunnydale Agreement. But it didn't really solve anything because it didn't give the people in Northern Ireland the right of self-determination. So eventually, what happens by 1998 is the British asked George Mitchell to help them come over to chair talks that will hopefully lead to a solution. And it wasn't all the Protestants that were wanting this trouble. There were many efforts to try and get everybody united. It was a small faction, really, as it usually is when things like this happen, that wanted to fight and have all violence going on. One of the groups is the Ulster Volunteers, which is a unionist militia founded in 1912. This is a Protestant organization. Now that word unionist is a very confusing term from Americans' point of view. The nationalists, the Catholics primarily, want a united Ireland. The unionists, the Protestants in Northern Ireland, want to remain united with Great Britain. So it's that word union being used differently. But a unionist is a Protestant, and a nationalist is a Catholic. This is the Civil Rights Association, and they had a rather diverse membership, some of them communists. They wanted to remain with Britain too. They're another group that's of that ilk. So, okay, so George Mitchell arrives, and at that point in time, you've got all these different parties. So the representatives of unionism are these, what did I do? Representatives of unionism are all Protestants, and some of them are violent, some of them are somewhat peaceful. And then you have the representatives of nationalism. Sinn Féin is the one that you hear about, we're hearing about mostly during the violent period. They've calmed down their act a bit now. They are actually in power in Northern Ireland right now. But they were the ones causing the bombings and stuff on that side. And then you have these other parties. They're loosely aligned to these types of things. The interesting group to me here is this Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. They were campaigning for social justice and peace. They were really trying. And they were begun by, I believe it's a Catholic socialist, her name's Williams, and social worker rather. And let me see here. Anyway, they were started by, one was a Catholic and one was a Protestant. And moving along here. So what do you get with the Good Friday Agreement? This was a best thing that could have happened, basically, considering everything that had gone on before. It established a system of government in Northern Ireland with the United Kingdom, and established a relationship with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and got everybody talking to one another. It established a relationship for the Republic of Ireland with the United Kingdom, and they're all in the EU at this point, so things were kind of working out a little bit. And there was one group, though, that was totally against this, and that was the Ian Paisley's party, the DUP. He didn't trust this agreement because he recognized right away that it was based on, I love the term, I saw it over and over again, constructive ambiguity. I thought to myself, I've got to use that sometimes in some situation. But basically, it left open the idea that they could have continual votes about whether or not that they should stay with England or unite with the Republic of Ireland. And Ian Paisley, the DUP party, was strongly against that. But anyway, it is signed on April 10th, 1998, which is why it's called the Good Friday Agreement. And Taoiseach, which is the Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, he was the Taoiseach of Ireland, and then you had George Mitchell and Tony Blair, and they managed to get this through with the constructive ambiguity. And it looked like things were going to be great, and they kind of were going pretty well, except you still had Ian Paisley around saying this is horrible. He was a Presbyterian, and he preached biblical literalism and anti-Catholicism in a big way. He just wanted the Catholics to leave. I think when you read about him, that was the only solution that was going to make him happy, and that wasn't going to happen. And he didn't like the open-endedness, as I said, of Northern Ireland being able to reconsider whether they should be part of England or united with the Republic of Ireland. And he believed that the European Union was a conspiracy to create a Roman Catholic superstate. He had many writings along that line. So, okay, coming up to 2011, this is Belfast. Is kind of typical of the places where you're hearing about all the violence now. Notice that the Catholics in 2011 census in Belfast, this is just North Belfast, were starting to outnumber, just by a slim margin, the Protestants. For the most part, where the violence is taking place in Ireland today is where the Protestants and Catholics tend to be of the same proportion. In many parts of Ireland, you'll get 70% of one religion and 30% of another, or close to it. There are a few other minority religions in there, but basically it's a Protestant Catholic kind of place. There's not as much violence happening where the demographics are really skewed one way or another. The big problems are happening in Derry, Belfast, and Carrickfergus, and places where the population is getting close. Whereas at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, I think it was more like overall 70% Protestant, the Northern Ireland. So the single market, the European single market, we heard a lot about that in the news, and this all got very confusing for Americans to listen to. This is when, in the European Union, the goods can pass through the capital, services, people are allowed to come and go. And that market was composed of 27 member states. And all was good during the Good Friday Agreement because that's what was in place. But when Brexit came along, it kind of, immediately when my first thought when I heard that Brexit was passed, that what's going to happen in Northern Ireland? Because the Good Friday Agreement was based on an open border. And now the border was going to have to be closed. And so Brexit passes and you start to see all of the artwork going up in Belfast and other places again. No Irish sea border. And then Sinn Féin demonstrating no border, no barrier, respect the Good Friday Agreement. That's where they were coming from. And then Protestants putting signs up like this. Well, if you're going to have a Brexit, then the border thing is null and void, and Belfast Agreement is no longer viable. So a lot of fighting broke out, and things got really nasty over there. And it's kind of what you can turn on the news about this today or read about it, and it's not getting too much better. Because Northern Ireland stayed in, with the Brexit deal in the end, Northern Ireland stays in the market, the common market, and is out of the EU. Everybody's unhappy, things are blowing up. And this is, I think, in Belfast. And here's what the Irish Sea border looks like. Basically, any goods coming in here, and they come in mainly to the port of Larne, which is right about here, have to go through major customs checks where they are lots of paperwork. You're not allowed to import at all any fresh meat, chilled meats rather. Anything like eggs and milk and stuff like that has to be totally inspected. So what's kind of been happening is that goods are coming in through here and going up that way. These ports are a mess. These were big ports, important ports. And basically Northern Ireland has been cut off from England. So they're really mad. So what does the flag of Ireland mean? This is my last slide. The green stands for the Catholics. The orange stands for the Protestants who look up to William of Orange. That's how they adopted the orange color. And the white in the middle stands for a lasting peace and truce. The issue is that this is not one country, it is still two countries. And this is the dream of where we could be someday. So that's that.
Thank you.